Welcome to Planning with Purpose.
Hey everyone, welcome into an all-new episode of Planning with Purpose with attorney Deb Morneau over at Courteous Law PC out in Henniker, New Hampshire. I'm your host, Mike Leon. You know, Deb's practice is known for its calm, compassionate approach to planning, the kind that helps families talk about hard topics with a little bit more ease and a lot less fear. Well, apropos for this episode, because today we're going to be talking about why honest conversations about death can make everything a little simpler, clearer, and more peaceful for the people you love. All right, Deb, you're gonna have to help me here on this one because this is a topic I'm sure a lot of people. I just had this conversation with my dad, a few months ago. A lot of people avoid it for as long as possible. What usually helps someone kind of take the first step towards talking openly about the end of life?
Well, so a lot of folks come to this conversation a little differently. Some folks are coming and chatting with me because something's happened in their family, or they recently had a loss, or maybe a recent diagnosis of something hard. I tell everybody it's a whole lot easier to talk about this when nothing is wrong. It's easier to talk about it before it becomes a crisis. But really, I tell everyone it's okay to talk about. It's better to talk about it before you wind up in a hard situation. This week, I've talked to a number of people who are in a tough spot. Somebody who's, going to be having a transplant in the next week. Somebody who had cancer surgery 2 days ago. And we had some really good conversations, and we talked about, life. We talked about happiness. We talked about closure. We talked all the hard subjects. But I really feel like if we can just, take a deep breath and sit down and have a conversation about life and death and what you want that death to look like. And man, that's a hard conversation, but it turns out that it's okay to talk about it. And people do have strong feelings. I really want to be at home. I really want my loved ones with me. Or, this doesn't feel like I want a whole lot of people around. And I tell everybody, you might change your mind in the moments prior to that happening or the days prior to that happening. And I tell folks, keep an open mind. We don't know how we're going to feel right at the very end. And, it's okay to talk about arrangements. It's okay to make arrangements. So, we just come to the table, I think, with a bit of an open heart, an open mind, and, a cup of coffee, a cup of tea, and just try to have the hard conversation.
Yeah. Well, I'm sure the coffee and the tea helps, but let me ask you, Deb, what in those conversations, what tends to kind of reassure them? Because they're obviously very nervous about the idea of planning. What has reassured them once they actually hear what the process involves?
Sure. So I think some of the things that reassure people are knowing that their wishes will be followed. So one of the things we talk about are post-death arrangements, right? Do you want to be buried or cremated? Do you want your ashes spread, or do you want them interred somewhere? Do you want to be buried at the Veterans Cemetery? What sort of service do you want to have? And I tell folks, if we get it on paper and we write it down and we communicate this to the people that are going to be responsible for that after you pass, I feel like it really lifts a burden for people. In my own situation, my mom had been very, very clear. She says, "Don't you dare have a sad funeral for me. I want you to have a party, and I want you to share stories, and you better play Jimmy Buffett music." And so my brother and I did exactly that. And, she knew we were going to do it, and we did. And you know what? In the end, that felt very honoring and very affirming for her. So I share that story with my clients. And I think it just helps people to feel like, okay, yeah, my wishes will be followed. Some people very much want a specific religious service, and some people are very specific, like, do not do that. I have clients who have very, it's not fun is not the right word, but unique ways of disposing or spreading their ashes. I have a client that actually owns a cannon, and he wants his ashes shot out of his cannon. And his son is prepared to do that. And he feels very confident that that will happen. And we talked about it, and it gave him a smile, even in a situation where he was, facing end of life issues. So I feel like if people have put down on paper what they want, it just does give them that reassurance.
Yeah. Can I ask you, piggybacking on that, can you kind of share, obviously without going into intricate details, but an anonymous situation where, you saw those honest early conversations make a difficult time noticeably easier for the family later on?
Yeah, absolutely. So, I had a set of clients where we had done their whole estate plan, we did their trust, all their documents, and um, the husband recently passed away, within the last month. And the wife and the children knew exactly what he wanted, and it was not an expected passing. But he had said, I want to be cremated, I want my ashes interred at the veteran cemetery, things like that. And it really made things so much smoother. He and his wife had looked at prepaying cremation expenses. And in New Hampshire, the New Hampshire Cremation Society will help with that. Different funeral homes will help with that. And so that just made things so much smoother for that family. And I think that even though it was a really, really hard situation, at least everybody kind of had a plan to follow, and it gave people something to hang on to and some steps to go by rather than it being, oh my gosh, now what do I do? It was, no, we know what we're going to do. This is how we're going to do it. And they just stepped through the process.
So, Deb, let's talk a little bit about these planning tools. We've talked about in previous episodes, trust, wills, and things like that. What are some that give people the most peace of mind once they're in place? Talk about them, power of attorneys, everything, all these different tools.
Absolutely. So, starting with the powers of attorney. So, I always do powers of attorney for finances and an advance directive for healthcare. Sometimes we call that a power of attorney for healthcare. Those two documents are super important because if you wind up in a spot where you have reduced capacity, dementia, fall down, hit your head, have a stroke, those two documents keep your loved ones from needing to go get a guardianship over you. So, talk about keeping the court out of your life. This is incredibly important. I've had some clients who have Parkinson's, and so to have those documents in place before that progressed too far was really, really super helpful. So having those in place, make sure that somebody at the time where you can't manage your own finances or can't make a healthcare decision, that somebody's there to do that for you. The other documents are having a trust or a will in place, and that just lets people know what you want to have happen with your assets, how the bills will be paid, things like that. That certainly gives people, just a very concrete plan to follow at the point where you're gone. They know exactly what you wanted to have happen with your assets. And then that final disposition form that I do with everybody is, what does the end of life look like? I want to be buried or cremated. I want to, have a celebration of life. I do not want to have a celebration of life. Please spread my ashes, or please don't do that. Please put me in the ground. I have some folks who are super committed, like, okay, when my spouse dies, I'm going to keep their ashes. When I die, I want my ashes and my spouse to be put together. And I want both of us to be interred at a certain funeral plot. There's a family plot where they could go. So people have different wishes and they want to put them on paper and make sure people follow them. And by clearly communicating, people can really just have that peace of mind that what they wanted to have happen was going to happen.
Yeah. Well, I'm sure the other part of this is, you're dealing with older folks a lot of the times in the planning stage, and they're trying to bring in their kids, aka me, into this discussion. What's a general way that you would advise them, even a practical way, that they could start sharing the wishes without making it feel overwhelming to the kids?
Sure. So some of my clients come in and they're like, we have not started to have this conversation. And I say, maybe the Thanksgiving table is not the spot to have that conversation, but you can tell your kids, hey, I went to go see our attorney today and we started talking about estate planning and she said we should have a conversation. That's a nice opener for folks. The other opener is, what? We saw our attorney and she said, if you want to come with us and meet with her and talk about what all this means, ask your questions, find out what it is that we've done for a plan. I always tell folks, I'm happy to meet with your kids, and I would rather meet with your kids, even a Zoom meeting, right? Because sometimes kids aren't living locally. Happy to Zoom. Let's meet. let's do this before it's a crisis. Let's do this before everyone is in grief. And grief clouds your thinking. It makes it much harder to make wise decisions. So let's do that ahead of time. So I just say I'm always open to chat with your kids. And even just that offer sometimes is enough to sort of take that stress right off of someone. So I do meet with a lot of kids, but I don't meet with a lot of kids simultaneously in the planning purpose, just, in that process, just because um, I want to make sure mom and dad or whichever parent it is, I want to make sure their wishes are, put on paper and are going to be followed. Sometimes kids have an idea about what should happen that can cloud the parents' desires. And then you can wind up with a conflict of interest. That's a whole nother conversation, but it's important as the attorney to protect that attorney-client privilege. But when the adult parents say, hey, please talk to my kid, happy to do it. And I do find that it really brings about a lot of clarity. And the kids are like, oh, this is the greatest thing. Then they go, maybe we should be doing our planning. And I say, yeah, maybe you should definitely be doing your planning.
Right.
So it's kind of multi-generational planning sometimes, which is
Yeah.
good.
And you know a lawyer, which is the best part. So, let, speaking of a different conversation altogether, what can happen when the families avoid the conversations altogether, and loved ones are now left guessing about what someone wanted? What does that look like?
So that looks like chaos. It really looks like chaos because, especially when you have subsequent marriages, maybe adult kids from two different relationships, things like that, it looks like people getting pretty frustrated with each other. One contingent says dad wanted to be buried at the VA cemetery. The other one says, no, no, no. Husband wanted me to cremate him and I'm keeping the ashes. Well, then you've got warring factions, and typically the spouse is going to prevail there, leaving a rift in a family. I see that a lot. So it is so much better to plan, and it is so much better to have a conversation, even if you don't put on paper the fact that you want to be buried or cremated, whatever you want to do. People need to know. And if all the people involved in your life, kids and spouse, don't know what you want, then they're going to be left guessing. And honestly, that's really hard in the midst of grief for everybody to be on the same page and to have that conversation. And then you're sitting in the funeral home with two different ideas about what should be happening. And then the funeral director is sort of a mediator all of a sudden. And that's also uncomfortable. And it's better to know what you want before you walk in to talk with the funeral home. So, putting it on paper and having the conversation saves a whole lot of grief from
Yeah.
happening. So
Well, Deb, for that listener in New Hampshire right now, they know it's time to start planning, but they're a little stuck. What's your best piece of advice for how they should start broaching that convo?
So I think the best piece of advice is just take a deep breath. Think about what it is that you want, sort of, look forward to the future and say, we're getting close to a time where somebody might pass. What is it that I want to have happen? Talk to your spouse about it, talk to your kids about it. If it feels too weird to talk to your kids about it, just call me, call another lawyer that does this kind of work. Come in and sit down. I don't charge people to come in and sit down and have this conversation. At least it opens up the door, and at least we can start figuring out what the process should look like. And then it just gives people, I think once you get over that initial hump of having the conversation, usually people are like, oh, this really wasn't so bad. We can talk about this. And yeah, it's uncomfortable to talk about those end of life discussions, the whole pull the plug sort of options. People begin to see it's a little more gray than that. It's a little more nuanced than that, but at least they feel like they have information and they know how to get started. So, either you start talking about it as a family or come in and talk to me or someone else about it. And, once the ball starts rolling, it's not as hard as it seems. So
Yep.
I'm happy to help.
Not as hard as it seems. I love that, the way you landed the plane there. Deb, thank you again for the time and the insights. I appreciate it as always.
Thanks, Mike. I really appreciate it.
And thank you for joining us on this installment of Planning with Purpose with Deb Morneau. If you want help right now creating a plan that kind of brings that clarity, that comfort, that peace of mind to the people you love, you can connect with Deb over at courteouslaw.com. One more favor before you head out the door. Do me a favor. Hit like, hit subscribe, leave a review, comment, share the episode with someone who has not started their estate planning today. As always, I'm Mike Leon. We'll see everybody next time.
Thanks for watching. Be sure to hit that like and subscribe button and leave us a review in the comments.